we must remember Professor B.N. Goswami, one of the leading art historians of the country, who contributed a lot in the domain of art history. And last 2-3 days, we have seen that practically every national Delhi has carried articles on his seminal contribution in the domain of art history. We're remembering him for 2 reasons. One, that he was our esteemed faculty. He brought our university to a place where we are. Secondly, the place we are sitting here. This place was renamed as Mulk Raj Anand Auditorium in July 2019. And on that occasion, Professor B.N. Goswami was the chief guest. So we start with 2 minutes of silence to pay our homage to the departed soul. Second. Thank you. We are co-hosting this lecture because in our department we have a literary society. For purposes of convenience, we call it Literary Society, but its original name is 300 Literary Society, which is quite enigmatic. Why 300? Because we used to have a strength of 300 students, 150 in MA1 and 150 in MA2. So we used to call it a 300 Literary Society, which would, on the face of it, would give some expanse and would also suggest that in the scheme of university, we are a sizable number. It's a big department even now. Our student strength master's strength has come down because we have started enrolling about 110 students in MA1, and same number then is elevated to MA2. But now we have more than 100 research scholars. About 50% of them are junior research fellows, and some of them are actually senior research fellows as well. Now, co-hosting this event is important for us for many things. One, that Nobel Prize, whenever it is announced or not announced, is always awaited with some kind of eagerness. Most of the times, the names that are anticipated or people who are likely to win the prize miss, and some other names crop up. And to our surprise, we come to know that writers writing in languages which are not well known are very prolific and have done tremendous in their respective cultural domains. In the Department of English, we are at a very interesting cusp in the sense that we are catering to literatures that are written in local languages, of course, in translation. We are teaching papers of comparative literature, Indian literature. And that way we are both region-centric and nation-centric. But another very equally important dimension of the department is that we are centrifugal too. We are teaching papers on world literature, on post-colonial literatures, and that in a way tells how broad the spectrum that we serve and we bask in. Our students then navigate in these different across these different registers, the local, the national, and the global. And therefore, when Nobel Prize is declared, the writers who win this prize are discussed. Of course, not formally, maybe after some time, these writers travel into the syllabus for a formal teaching. But yes, in our tea clubs, in our informal conversations, we do talk about the Nobel Prize winners. I'm happy that in this series of lectures, which is predominantly about Nobel Prizes in sciences, we also feature. And that tells us that in the days to come, we are building bridges and that we are coming closer. This kind of compartmentalization of knowledge will have to go. It is already on its way out. So what I want to tell you is that Literary Society in the past, in the department has been inviting poets and writers in local languages, in Hindi, Punjabi, of course, English. And therefore, our students have benefited a lot from such interactions. For more light on contribution of B.N. Goswami, he was a former professor of art history here, and on this series of lectures on the Nobel Prize winners, I invite Professor Arun Grover, former Vice Chancellor of the University and scientist of repute. Professor Arun Grover, please.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to have this occasion to interface with all of you on the occasion of Nobel Prize in Literature 2023 lecture by Pushpinder Sayalji. This is in the series of lectures on Nobel Prizes in Sciences, Economics, Peace, Turing Award, Abel Award, and the World Food Prizes. This series was suggested to us by none other than late Professor I.B.S. Pasi in the year 2020, when the pandemic arrived and there was a lockdown. The Society for Promotion of Science and Technology prior to it used to hold lectures on Nobel Prizes in science subjects at different locations in the university, different departments of the university. But once the pandemic arrived and it was not possible, Professor Pasi, as the president of the Chandigarh chapter of National Academy of Sciences of India, he called me up. He constituted a small committee under me and directed me that let this exercise happen every year. So 9 lectures in a year, we were supposed to do it. And for the last 3 years, we did that before December 10. That is the day when the Nobel Prizes are awarded. This year, the president of SPSTI, Mr. Dharamveer, who is not present here today, he said, no, everything has opened up. So let's do these lectures in the hybrid mode. So the first lecture was hosted on November 6 in Department of Microbiology, and it was delivered by Professor Javed Agrawala, Bhattacharya Prize awardee from IIT Rockford. So this is our second lecture, and a special feature of this annual Nobel Prize lectures in literature is that since the year 2020, all the 4 lectures have been delivered by Professor Pushpinder Sayalji. The guest of honor have changed though. The first year, Professor Vivek Atre was there with us online. Second year, it was Professor B.S. Barar. Last year it was Rajiv Lochan, Professor Rajiv Lochan, and this year this task is being performed by the head of the English department, namely Akshay. So we have had 4 lectures. 2020 prize was awarded to group from US. Next year it was Abdul Razak Gurna, a Tanzanian based in UK. And last year it was Annie from France. And this year we have Jan Posse. So the Nobel Prize in Literature have been given, I think, 119 times so far. And women have featured 17 or 18, but this gender ratio is now changing. Since the year 2000, I think it's about 5:8. So things are changing, and I hope when we have lots of contribution from India in the field of literature in different languages, but probably our work is not that well known. It would get well known once the technology is there, and within India, once we start appreciating the literature in other languages, the rest of the world will also start appreciating what is happening in our country. So we have to improve things internally first before the globally will start receiving recognition. So with this, I conclude, and I'm looking forward to an erudite presentation as it has been for the last 4 years from Professor Pushpinder Sihal. Thank you very much.
People in the department know about the stature and the caliber of Professor Pushpinder Sihal. But for a formal introduction, I invite Dr. Meenu Gupta, so that those who have come from outside or those who are joining online may know more about her.
Thank you, Professor Akshay. As Akshay has told, we all know ma'am so well that she needs no introduction, but still it's always an honor and pleasure to introduce her to the people who don't know, though I'm sure there's no one. So Professor Sihal superannuated from the Department of English and Cultural Studies some years ago. She obtained her PhD from Lancaster University. Her research interests include linguistics, literature and English language teaching. She was the director of the Commonwealth Academic Staff Scholarship from 1984-87. Her many achievements include Charles Wallace Trust Fellowship and the Australia-India Council Fellowship. She was the director of IFLU, Lucknow campus from 2010-11. She has published over 30 papers and 2 books and has translated novels and plays from Punjabi to English and authored poetry and fiction. With over 35 years of experience in teaching, researching, and guiding PhD scholars at the university, Professor Sihal is a highly respected figure in the field of literature and linguistics. Her versatile knowledge in the fields of pedagogy, critical literacy, linguistics, and stylistics always make her lectures interesting and insightful. As Professor Grover has already informed us that she gave an expository lecture on the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2020 as well. And when she was approached once again this year, she consented immediately to deliver the lecture. So, Akshay, yeah, thank you.
So I invite Professor, please come. Sir, you come in.
हाँ? ओहो, अच्छा। नेक्स्ट नेक्स्ट हो जाएगा नेक्स्ट हाँ जी नेक्स्ट नेक्स्ट फ्रॉम हियर
हाँ जी
ओके या ऑलराइट
वापस
ऑलराइट
वापस
Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Thank you so much for turning up to attend this talk on the Nobel Prize for Literature. I'm always delighted. This is the 4th year running that the kind invitation of Professor Grover and Professor Dharamveer and the SPSTI family, I've been invited to deliver these talks. And it's always wonderful because I too get to read up on some of these writers. Some of them one knows of, one has read a little bit of, some you haven't read at all. And that's a good thing because then you get to know a new writer, a new person emerges on your horizon, and that is a great opportunity. So I'm very happy to be here today, and I'll be talking about Jan Fosse, who's won the Nobel Prize for Literature this year. In this talk, I will be following the usual practice that I have done, I've followed in earlier talks, which is that I would give an overview of the writer's work, and maybe focus on one or two significant works, because this is a writer who's very, very prolific. And you can see here that there's a considerable body of work that he has produced. And obviously, all of it cannot be given adequate treatment. I'll just begin by saying that when we look at writers from different cultures or different geographic and linguistic backgrounds, we might be able to understand them better if we bring our own perspective to bear on them. So I'll try to do that if I can. And also that all those writers from similar backgrounds have their particular appeal. However, literature from unfamiliar backgrounds helps us to know more about other people. And it's a very vital effort in the world at any time to get to know other people. So when we look at John Fosse, we can see the voice of the Nordic spirit. And we might say that that Nordic spirit or the Nordic temperament is perhaps very different from the part of the world that we live in or from our culture. So it might be worthwhile looking at what that is, what the Nordic is. Now, we admire a great deal about the Scandinavian countries. And most of all, we admire their welfare system. And we admire their relative neutrality and distance from nefarious big power politics. And we also admire their much publicized happiness index, which they keep saying that Finland, Denmark, happiest countries. And we have a lot of admiration for what we look at Scandinavian countries as being models of that. But it also begs certain questions. These conditions, of course, are in themselves great ideals for people in countries like India, for whom the orderliness of the state welfare system or the peace and quiet rather than the tumult and chaos that we are most familiar with are highly desirable conditions. But one might doubt this kind of happiness index that we often hear about. And happiness, I think, is something which is culturally defined and personally experienced. And for people in these orderly societies, happiness is often not externally expressed. You can never guess from their silent, closed exteriors about their calm and peace quotient. You can't guess from their demeanor. Because they're not exactly jumping around with joy. I found on a recent visit to Denmark that people were not very communicative. Though I met some nice people in Copenhagen and in Roskilde University, but they tend to speak less and they tend to be very not flamboyant at all and not communicative at all. Even if they are very pleased about something, they will not let it show. So happiness for them, it seemed to me, lies in structured routines lived in manageable chunks, rather than wandering around loosely throughout their day. And if they do adventure, then adventure has its own slot and must not leak into other activities and situations. So everything has its particular slot. So now the state which takes care of everything can be a mixed blessing. Every state has its own ideological apparatus, however non-interfering and non-totalitarian it may profess to be. So there is the other side to state intervention. And everything being in the ambit of the state, I can give the example of this Hindi film that some of you might have seen, Mrs. Chatterjee versus Nobel. And it tells us a little bit about the frightening aspect of state intervention in certain areas of human life where we may not actually require it, or it may actually prove to be detrimental to family and community relationships. So, this has important implications for individual lives, because individual lives, when they are lived within family and community, they are lived within a structure of need. And when that need disappears, because the state is taking care of everything, then those community and social structures also suffer. And the individual kind of is cut loose or cut adrift, you might say. Now you might say that that's a kind of, but if we look at a lot of dystopian writing, Fosse's writing is not dystopian. It takes a different trajectory. But I'm just sort of, mentioning that if you look at a lot of dystopian writing, a lot of it is to do with the negative impact of totalitarian tendencies in state control. And so what we see in the writings, in the kind of individual explorations, individualistic explanations in the writings of Jean Fosse, is that the individual perceives himself as a lone ranger, a consciousness adrift, and the structures that may sustain our human relationships fall down in the absence of any structures of community life, because everybody is given everything by the state, and so they are very much on their own. So it makes the need for connection redundant in many ways, and an experience of cold isolation from closer knit communities results. Now, I'm saying this because many Nordic writers display these traits, and you might have heard of Knausgaard. Again, both Jean Fosse and Knausgaard are lesser known writers. They are, called obscure sometimes. When it comes to the Nobel Prize, everybody is not happy because with the choice of the Academy, because there are some people for whom that writing, has meaning, and others find it obscure and less accessible and hardly, deserving of a Nobel Prize. So it's it's not that Nobel Prize is not the only criteria for greatness in a writer. But nevertheless, it is important. And when a writer does get it, then some attention is drawn to certain writers who may otherwise remain very obscure. So there is some merit in choosing slightly less known writers. And we might think that Margaret Atwood should have got it, or Murakami should have got it, etc. And every year we want our favorites to win, but literary tastes are different for different people. And so we are happy with getting to know some writer who's new and unknown. And of course, Fosse is not new because he has a long career going back to many years. But these Nordic writers have this kind of a certain kind of trait, which is when we say that a writer reflects the age and a writer reflects the society, the community, or the ancestry to which he or she belongs, then certainly Knausgaard and Fosse are. Knausgaard was a student of Fosse's, actually. And you can see that even in the crime thrillers, because some of the Norwegian writers and Swedish writers are good crime writers, you know. So you have that scenario often being built up in Stieg Larsson, or, you know, Stieg Larsson, so many novels, and then films were made of Stieg Larsson's novels. You know, there is snow falling, there's blood on the snow, there is a dark atmosphere all around, you know, the ideal atmosphere for some sort of, you know, sort of dark crimes to be performed. And in fact, in one of Fosse's collections, Scenes from a Childhood, there is in fact a narrative in which, because it's a collection of stories, in which there is a child who is himself, actually. And that child, he says that story is titled, "And My Dog Will Come Back to Me." That's the title of the story. And what happens is that this child's dog runs out, and then somebody comes to him, some woman comes to him and tells him, you know, your dog has been shot. And he says, oh, where? And all that. He's trying to find his dog. So he runs around and all that, and he finds it. And that woman says that, oh, you know, I think I know the man who shot him, and go and search for him. So he goes and he actually does find that his dog has been shot. His head has been, you know, blasted through, and the dog is lying on his own, the steps of his own house. That man who shot him has thrown him there. So now he says, okay, now I'm going to kill this man. And so he takes the dog, and he takes the dog up to his bedroom, and he puts the dog in his bed with a blasted head on his pillow. And then he goes out, and then he thinks about, and he plans to kill the man. So at night, then he actually, you know, there's a lot of this Norwegian landscape, you know, which is, you know, there are these fjords, and everybody has a boat. So the boats are always available. So he takes a boat, and he takes a pitchfork, and he rows out to the water, and then in the middle of the night, and then he reaches that person's house, and he is, you know, wears a hoodie and a mask, etc., etc. And then he takes a pitchfork, and he actually goes and kills that man, and then he escapes, and he throws the food to his house, and then he sort of, you know, digs a grave for the dog. After that, so you get the drift. You know, you get the drift. You get the kind of atmosphere, and you get the sort of you know, the sort of possibility of crime at every step. You know, so it's as if some of these people that you see in his writing are always on the edge of performing some kind of crime. Now, it might ring some bells. It might ring some bells to maybe Camus or some other writers, you know, Dostoevsky. It might ring a few bells when you look at characters in a state when they are contemplating crime, and how they contemplate it and how they reflect upon it. You know, all this is, what I'm trying to do is trying to define some things about the Nordic spirit and how it comes up again and again in these writings, and then later on in some of the films, etc. And even in, incidentally, also in the general way in which, let's say, design and architecture also. So a culture is a composite whole. So it's not like it's just the literature which will reflect certain things. You'll find those reflected in other cultural aspects also. So, for instance, the IKEA and the Bauhaus traditions of design, so they also have that same starkness, which seems to say, the hell we care about ornamentation and embellishment and things like that. What we want to see is stark. What later on the architecture came to be called brutalist also. But brutalist is not one thing. It's many different styles. So these kinds of reflections that we find tell us something about this spirit that informs Fosse's novels and fiction as well as plays, because he's an important playwright also. I'll come to that how those students of literature would know about Henrik Ibsen being one of the very, very important Norwegian playwrights, and Fosse being compared to Ibsen a lot. But personally, I think that he doesn't resemble Ibsen so much as what others have pointed out, the resemblance to Beckett, and the absurdist kind of drama of Beckett. And it struck me also that literature students may also know about the Irish playwright J.M. Synge, and the kind of, elemental sort of atmosphere that we find in those Irish plays also, the relationship to the sea as well, that we find, I think at least, that it's there in Jean Fosse also. So in Fosse's world, it's a closed world of one's own alter egos. Now, it's very interesting that, the word doppelganger. Now, Fosse deals with doppelgangers. Doppelgangers are clones of oneself only. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if you always looked at yourself and then you looked at other forms of yourself also being with you all the time, and that you are not one person, but you're several persons coexisting at the same time. And sometimes you're experiencing that, and sometimes you're experiencing the other one. And so these alter egos are there, and not so many characters as you find, many different characters you find in writers, but you find versions of the same character coming up again and again. And then the writer meditates and negotiates his experiences. And then he develops through exploring some very, very sort of, you could say, dark, uncomfortable issues of aging, death, and even of godliness. And now that's interesting, because the impression you get of people over there is that they are not much concerned with religion. Now, there's a whole history behind that. There's a whole history behind that because there was earlier, Catholic Christianity. But then before that, we mustn't forget the Vikings, because Norway has its Viking history and the Viking gods. And the Viking gods is nothing to do with Christianity. They were much before Christianity came to influence the Europe and then reached Scandinavia. But the Vikings and the Norse, now that's also important, because the Norse culture had its own medicines, it had its own philosophy, it had its own, most importantly, it had its own language called Old Norse. And an interesting aside is that my granddaughter got fascinated with the Norse mythology, as you know, a lot of you would relate to that, through Marvel comics and through Thor and through all these, these heroes. And then that led her to investigate a bit more of what is Old Norse and what was the Nordic kind of culture, old ancient Nordic culture. And in my visit, of course, I saw how carefully they have preserved their Viking ships and how they have kept their, that heritage intact. But later on, they had the Christianity came in, and Christianity came in largely through in the 15th century through the Reformation of Martin Luther, which is Protestantism, not Catholic. So now, after Protestantism, it seems to be the case that it's become a Christless universe in the sense, as far as Europe is concerned, nobody is very much interested in religion. And people don't go to churches or anything, be they Protestant or otherwise. But I was really happy to see handwritten version of Martin Luther's writings in the museum in Copenhagen. So so now this kind of godlessness in a universe which is in a world which is otherwise also deprived of human contact, who do you go to? Because, sometimes religion comes and saves, and Jean Fossé is concerned with how he might find such a religion, how he might find some such thing to relate to. And in his exploration then, he tries to solve many of the contradictions that he finds, and then reach something which a critic has called a quietly powerful moral stance. Now, one word about the politics also, that writers like Fossé, you might say they are obscure or they are not much connected with social realities, because he's not exactly a realist writer. But writers like Fossé have a healing effect, because their voice is very gentle, and it is a voice which opposes the stridency of state politics, of state policies. He says that just by writing in the language I do, Near Norse, and growing up as I did, there's a kind of political dimension to my writing. So these two things he's mentioning growing up the way I did and the very choice of language. And the third I'll add is that his writing taught him to incline towards the spiritual. I'm quoting him, Jean Fossé, in an interview. He says, "I wrote and I didn't understand where it was coming from. How do I manage it? It's coming from somewhere else," unquote. So this is how he begins to find out what that spiritual dimension is. This is something that actually might kind of redeem that moment or that life of isolation on the west coast of Norway, living by the sea all alone. And also, these are some of the themes that I've put up on the PowerPoint. But there is one of the features of his writing is that I'll come to that a little later, but I have not mentioned New Norse. New Norse is known as the New Norwegian language. Now, John Fossé is distinguished by the fact that he writes a language which is a dialectal kind of it's a development from a dialect. Now, something you might be much interested in knowing that that Norway doesn't have a language. Okay. Now, again, a little bit that I mentioned about the history of Norway is that after around the 1300s, the original Norse culture disappeared, okay, because of the Black Death, the plague. So much of Old Norse texts, their intellectual tradition, their scholarly and religious texts, etc., disappeared. What you see through Marvel, etc., is by no means any approximation of what actually Norse is like. So Norse disappeared around the 13th century because of the decimation of the population and the very hostile kind of climate that they had. But meanwhile, there was a lot going on in Europe. And what happened was that the Danish people, the Danish conquered Norway. And Denmark has been a kind of ruling power over the other Scandinavian countries for quite some time. And Danish became the language of that part of Norway. Sweden and Denmark actually had protracted wars. I didn't know about that till I actually visited, and I came to know that there were all this cannon on the seashore and all that, pointing towards Stockholm. And then I realized, then I was told that this is because Sweden and Denmark were at war. And that was a part of history I didn't know about at all. But what happened was that this was during the Napoleonic era. And during that time, some powers supported Napoleon and some powers opposed. Now, Denmark opposed Napoleon, but Sweden had Sweden and Britain had opposed Napoleon, and Denmark was on Napoleon's side. When Napoleon lost, then Denmark actually also suffered from that, and Sweden became more powerful. Now, so then under some treaty, Sweden was able to take away portions of Norway away from the possession of Denmark. But by that time, most of the Norwegians, most of Norway spoke Danish. And Danish language only had the predominancy, and it had the status and prestige and everything. There was no such thing as Norwegian language. And even today, what we say Norwegian, there isn't any Norwegian. Because one very interesting thing about languages is the dialects. And dialects, you will find that are influenced by geography a lot. Because, the very definition of dialect is the area where that language is spoken. So now we know Norway is full of all these fjords. And the fjords create all these valleys, deep valleys. And in these deep valleys, they are cut off from one another. So everywhere you will find a different dialect developing. So there will be hundreds of dialects in all the hundreds of valleys that are there in the whole length of Norway. It's a narrow kind of country. One might compare it a little bit with some parts of Himachal and the northern, the Himalayas, because in those parts also we have the mountainous regions, and we have the remote villages, remote places, remote tribes, etc. And therefore, proliferation of dialects. So dialects proliferate wherever there are geographical barriers. And within Norway, there are hundreds of dialects because they don't have any standard language. They didn't have any standard language because Danish was the language that they spoke. Then after Sweden loosened the influence of Denmark, you see, Denmark has, in a limited sense, it's also been an imperial power. It still has control over the Faroe Islands. It still has control over Greenland, though they are autonomous now. But it has had this control over the neighboring Scandinavian countries quite a lot. And as you know, it's a kingdom, so it's a kingdom. And they have their kings and queens also. I happened to see a beautiful place built for the queen who is still living, but in anticipation of her death, they've already built a beautiful monument where she's going to be buried. So they still have kind of quite a lot of wonderful castles and things like that for their royalty. So this close connection with the Danish influenced the Norwegians. Now, what happened was then that there was a closely influenced form of Danish that got to be written in the quest for a standard language, written language in Norway. This was called Bokmål. Bokmål is spoken in the area around Oslo and all that. So it is the most standardized written form. There are two forms of Norwegian that are standardized and written, which is Nynorsk and Bokmål. Bokmål is spoken by 90% speakers, and Nynorsk, that's the language that John Fosse writes in, is spoken by only 12% of the population in Norway. And that is on the west coast. Bergen is a city, Bergen, and over there around that area, there are many dialects. And you could say that the written language, it's both Nynorsk and Bokmål are two written languages, but they are a composite of many dialects. So it's a very interesting kind of situation where you have two different forms of the same kind of language coexisting. Both are written, both are taught in schools, but they are similar. Even a newspaper could have articles written, some articles written in Nynorsk and some articles written in Bokmål. They are so similar to one another. But there are differences, there are linguistic differences. So it's like when, in Punjab, we have this Shahmukhi and Gurmukhi, which are scripts, two different scripts of the same language. And obviously how these scripts developed has its own history. And how they are divided by the border now. In Norway, these two languages are not divided by any border. They are in the same country, and but there are so many more differences. In the case of Punjabi, it is just the script that's different. Otherwise, the grammar and the pronunciation, the speech of Punjabi remains the same. It's just the script. You can write it in the Shahmukhi or you can write it in Gurmukhi. But over there are important morphological changes in between Nynorsk. And one linguist says, quote, that there is probably more morphological variation in our community of 5 million than in the entire English-speaking world. So though we say English is all over the world, but the different Englishes, American English, British English, etc., are not that much morphologically different. They are not different in their grammar, pronunciation and accent somewhat, but not fundamentally different. But he says that there is morphological variation across linguistic levels between these two languages. Yet people living in Norway can understand each other. If they're Bokmål speakers, not speakers actually, because Bokmål is also written language and Nynorsk is also written. Now, why is this important? Because after all these reforms, etc., took place, and Nynorsk meaning new Norse, as contrast to the old Norse of 1,000 years ago. This is New Norse, and this Fosse says this is why his choice of language is political, because there are fewer speakers of the language, and that's why he says that, while not directly political, writing in a dialectal form of a language itself becomes a political choice. So that is one important choice. And I'd like to say something about this, that yes, we often say that if a writer writes in a dialect, then that writer actually becomes a person who validates that language, brings that dialect up to a higher level, because we say a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And of course, Norway then got its army and navy and air force. But it's also a dialect. A language is a dialect with the literature. That's also important. And so when people write in that language, as John Fosse has written in New Norse, it brings up that language to the recognition of the important important languages of the world. So, what's wrong? Okay. So, so there's a problem though with using dialects, because then they are not accessible to everybody. And so it will automatically also limit the writer's exposure, because if it's only spoken by a small section of the population, say let's 12% of people in Norway, and that on the western part of Norway, along the western shore of Norway, then that writing in that language would, of course, become very important for that small section of people, but it wouldn't be available for all the other people around the world. So, so that's why we sometimes, I think it's a misperception that writing in a vernacular pushes up that vernacular to some higher status. When access to that vernacular is through translation in a prestige language, then what happens to the vernacular? Because any access to that vernacular will be through a prestige language like English or French, etc., to make it available to a larger public. So we would like to believe that it upgrades the vernacular, and certainly some recognition is obtained, but the space it occupies is still exclusive and limited unless it is translated. Now here, therefore, there is the importance of translation. You know that last year we know that this book by Gitanjali Shri and Red Samadhi benefited so much by translation, because and what happened was that the translator Daisy Otway also. So the translator also got a share of the prize. But I don't know why they don't do that with the Nobel, because most of the books translated that are translated when they're from different parts of the world, like last year's Annie Ernaux in French, from French, and this one, Jean Fossé, because this is even more important because it's in New Norse, which is a much lesser known, less prestigious language. So so this is the role of the translator, and the translator for Jean Fossé is very lucky that he's got a translator who is universally praised by all readers who have read Jean Fossé in translation, and also who know something about Norwegian, Damien Searles. So Damien Searles is a translator, and he is a marvelous kind of translator because he's captured the rhythms of prose that Jean Fossé has created. Now, that is something I'd like to say a little bit about, that, one of the reasons why Jean Fossé may not be so easy to read, is because there's no plot. Absurdist work is it dispenses with the traditional realist or with the traditional sense of plots, etc., and story, and it's in an existential frame that the characters exist, and they are engaged with the inner dilemmas, existential dilemmas. So anyways, there isn't, it's anti-plot. But along with that, Fossé's language, which Damien Searles has captured from New Norse, is repetitive, very repetitive. So the same sentence is repeated again and again. In fact, one of his major works is Septology. Septology is a whole novel is one sentence only. The whole novel is just one sentence. There is no full stop. And you might think how strange that might be. Impossible to read something like that. Then you're also reminded of James Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, etc., some other experiments in modern writing which are like that. But what is different about Jean Fosse is that it's very rhythmic also. So that it's not just that the one sentence goes on, but there are repetitions in that sentence where the same things are repeated again and again. And again, any reader would say, I've also read some critics saying, or some readers saying, sorry, I stopped reading after the first few pages because the same sentences are being repeated again and again. The same things are being repeated again and again. So I can't cope with this. So a lot of readers get put off with that kind of style. But, it creates a flow. That rhythm also, that repetitiveness also creates a certain kind of flow. And once the reader understands that, okay, this is the principle of the writing. You have to understand the grammar of every writer. So once you catch that this is the principle of this kind of writing, this is the principle that the writer is following. So then you kind of become more with it. You become more with that. And then you begin to participate a little more in that flow. And once you do that, then you can see the sort of entire picture or the unfolding of it. It's a lot like, when we meditate, how is it that, we find it so difficult for any period of time, for a longer period of time, to simply just watch the rise and flow of breath, because it seems so boring, so repetitive. And so we can't do it for a long time. So this is what happens in writing like this, that, simply just to see the rise and flow of repetitive sentences seems to be, a boring thing to do. But once you understand that every time it's unraveling and it's, giving you a certain sort of experience of discovery, then you will be, but it requires some fortitude to stay with that kind of writing. Also because the protagonist, whoever the alter ego or the doppelganger is, generally a melancholy person. One of Jean Fosse's novels, Melancholy 1 and Melancholy 2, is about the life of an artist who was psychotic and delusional and all that. So that can itself suggest to you, the title itself suggests that. Now, so this kind of character combined with, that repetitive kind of sentence going on, and you look at the anxieties, you look at the isolation of such characters, and maybe memory loss, maybe a lot of darkness there, and just moving around in circles in that psychological darkness. So all that, and then it might be too much for anybody to take. But what, as I said, I use the word redeem, perhaps that's a big word to use, but what changes things in Jean Fosse's work then is that it moves between the material and the spiritual worlds, and begins to have some kind of a glimmer of the mystical emerging from that. And that seems to kind of tell us about what this whole experience is worth, whether it's worthwhile. And just to quote, that it's definitely true that when things are the darkest, blackest, that you see the light. This is Jean Fosse himself. And then he says, now, remember the Nobel citation says that he gave voice to the unsayable. And I was thinking about that what is unsayable? What do they mean when they say that he says the unsayable? So the unsayable is the silent. The unsayable is silence itself. Silence itself in how it reveals, how silence reveals silence. And in his own words, his aim is to somehow make the silence speak and establish a second silent language behind the spoken language. And this, he says, happens a lot in drama. He says, and this is where you remember Waiting for Godot and you remember Beckett. Because there you see that that just this space of silence on the stage, brings up something which is dealing with the unsayable. So, so in Jean Fosse's plays, we see that. Although, again, in the Anglo-Saxon world, his plays were often not received very well. And I must tell you that, he says that the critics said that the plays are gloomy and claustrophobic, and there is a quote: "Nil points Norway." So nil points Norway. Wherever there's something most gloomy and claustrophobic, and at a nil place, that's Norway. So like terra nullis, that they used to say. So it's adding the cold and the Nordic to the absurdic experience, and you can see then what kind of cocktail that might make. However, I'll quote something else by moving towards the conclusion, that here it is said of him that, quote, "An artist struggles with faith and loneliness and watches himself or versions of himself fall away into the lower depths. The social world seems distant and foggy in this profound existential narrative," unquote. Now, people from literature might think, oh gosh, we've had enough of that in the entire 20th century, and now more of the same. But what we find that it's never the same, since the style of every writer and the way that every writer deals with the material, that is always new. Each time a writer defines the form, the shape of literature, be it a play, novel, or poetry, humanity discovers new hope, new substance. Some writers are more difficult, more challenging. Their writing requires patience and faith, but they will always give to us. They will always give to us because they are redefining experience itself. So I'll just conclude by quoting from the midst of it's only one sentence. I can't say one of the sentences because the whole novel is one sentence only. Septology is in 7 volumes, by the way. And then it has been republished in 3 volumes, as I had put up over here, the names. I am another name, etc. So these are 3 volumes that come up, and you might think the other name, I is another, and a new name. Now it's interesting that, you see, a writer is writing like this, the new name, and at the same time writing a new language, new Norse, writing in a new language. So not only is his writing new, his language is new. He's actually inventing the language as he goes along, because this is a language in the process of being birthed, the birthing of language, where it transforms from being a combination of numerous dialects spoken in different parts of the country, and then coming together somehow in the writing, in a written form, perhaps not necessary to call it a standard form, but in a written form, which actually means creating the language by itself. So from the midst of the continuous sentence of septology, the rhythmic voice comes up. I'll just quote: "I want to let everything be empty. Yes. Empty and silent. Yes. Silent. Yes. Silent and dark. Because the only thing I long for is silence. Yes, I want everything to remain perfectly silent. I want a silence to come down over me like snow and cover me. Yes, I want the silence. I want the silence to snow down and cover me. Make me invisible. Make everything invisible. I think, and all these thoughts will go away. All the pictures gathered up in my memory, tormenting me, will go away. And I will be empty, just empty. I will become a silent nothing, a silent darkness. And maybe what I'm thinking about now is God's peace. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe it has nothing to do with what people call God, etc., etc. So it goes on. So, as Hamlet would have said, the rest is silence. Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions from the audience?
Yeah. You need a mic? You need a mic? Yeah.
Of very interesting architecture, and I'm so glad I could make it. It's something like entering into a world of an author that one is really not know nothing about. And so is the geography and the domain, etc. And I was, marveling at the fact that how important the dialect and language in all of this is. And I think no better person than you, because I could see what an adventure ride it was for you to see,
Yeah.
The dialect bit and the language bit
Yeah.
when it came to
Yeah.
John Paul's.
Yeah.
That was very, very interesting.
Yes, and I do have SPSTI to thank for that. That because as a linguist, it was absolutely fascinating, and I kept on getting drawn further and further and further into the historical and the geographical reasons why languages and how languages develop the way they do and how they come up. Norway has been rife with debate, political debate on language, because all they desired was to get away from Danish, get away from the influence of the Danish language. And for a long time, they struggled with different versions that they could make, just like Fosse struggles with different versions of himself. They were struggling with different versions that they could make of mixture. Ek mixture tha Dano-Norwegian, and some said, no, it still prioritizes the Danish. So let's say Norse Danish and things like that. It was so difficult to get away from the morphological, structural speech of the Danish also, because they were developing their own pronunciation of words, and the Danish pronunciation is different, and the Danish is very, very difficult to pronounce. I thought that one could learn from the spelling, but you can't. Whereas Swedish is a little easier in the sense that you can learn from spelling. You can speak from spelling better. So there's been a whole struggle for the last century or so. And they even tried to establish some other language during the World War II, the influence of German. And so there's been a long struggle to develop these Bokmal and Norse, New Norse, where it's written as NY, N-O-R-S-K. So New Norse. So they are, and that's why Jan Fosse is getting the Nobel Prize this year, is quite interesting, because suddenly the world comes to know that there is this important language, or this, although it's spoken by a few people, but they're very fiercely kind of conscious of it, and they write in it. It's a written language. It's developed from just what you might call, we say dialect, just dialect. We should remove the word just from dialect. A dialect is actually a language in every possible way. It's just that it's just limited in its area and the number of people who speak it. But it can be very, very complete, diverse in its own way, much more than languages which have been standardized and then in the same form exist in so many places. So it was a wonderful kind of, and I'm now kind of thinking differently about Norway and about the Danish, and I'll certainly question my Danish friends on it, that, you kind of quite hegemonistic towards Norway, towards Norwegians by imposing your language on the Norwegians for such a long time. So yes, thank you for that comment. And there are always new things to discover when it comes to language, languages all over the world. And a writer like that really immediately brings it forward and brings the whole debate out into the open. And it helps us to reflect on our own, like Akshay said earlier, about our own languages also, and about the hundreds of things that we remain undiscovered about our languages.
Any other question?
Online, anybody who wanted to ask online? There was someone online that was.
No question.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for Nobel.
So on behalf of SPSTI, the Chandigarh chapters of INEAS, NASI, and on behalf of CRIC and even on behalf of the Literary Society of Department of English and Cultural Studies, I'm extending a word of thanks and as a gratitude to Professor Sayal. Thank you so much for voicing your views on such an important topic. Why we organize all these lectures is to instigate you into a very important human trait, which is called effective listening. Because unless you are a good listener, you won't be able to express yourself and you will not have a perception of your own. So I find you very good listeners, but you should also speak up because what is coming from this side should also be reflected, right? And writings actually reflect your own self, and it's a kind of rediscovering your own human self. So nowadays we don't write, we only type, right? And that has become a very effective trait for communication. But still, I think writing with your own hands is a different kind of an experience, which I think these kind of lectures which we organize should incite you into getting into that practice. So thank you very much for being a very effective listening audience. And thank you, Department of English. Namaskar. And please join us for a cup of tea afterwards.